Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Hello, this is Muhammad Imran. I hope you're doing well. This is lecture number 5 in the subject Style and Stylistics. This lecture focuses on foregrounding as a device in literary stylistics. It is used by researchers to investigate how the author has foregrounded the elements in literary discourse to achieve certain aims. First, we will define what is literature, then what is literariness, then we will have a detailed discussion on foregrounding, foregrounding effects, and foregrounding as a device to defamiliarize literary elements in a text. This lecture is very fruitful for those who take foregrounding as a literary device to analyze a literary text. So let's begin this lecture. First, we will define what is literature. While literature has several definitions, but here we will define literature according to Coleridge, which for me is the most authentic definition to literature. So what he says about literature? Literature as an art is surely to arouse the excitement of emotion for the purpose of immediate pleasure through the medium of beauty. So then this definition has 4 fundamental parts. In part first, Coleridge tells us what is literature. So literature is an art. In part 2, he tells us what is the function of literature. So literature arouses the excitement of emotions. So this is the function of literature. In part 3, he tells us the purpose of literature. So what is the purpose? The purpose of literature is to provide us immediate pleasure. When we read a novel, when we read a poem, it provides us immediate pleasure. And in part 4, he tells us that what kind of medium should be of literature. So he says through the medium of beauty. We use figure of speech, we use imagery, we use symbolism. So we beautify the language. So a beautiful language is used to write literature. So this is the overall definition to literature according to Coleridge. So this is okay. I like the most. This is the proper and it seems to me a complete definition to literature. Another definition to literature by Tung 2007. He says literature is a verbal artfulness. So literature is related to art. And then he says proper choice. The word choice in a piece of text, a poem or a novel should be proper one. And then a good arrangement of all linguistic component. So we have different linguistic component, for example, phonological, morphological, syntactic, semantics, and pragmatics. So he says that these all component or linguistic components should be also properly arranged. So then we have 3 parts of this definition. In the first part, he says literature is an art or verbal artfulness. In the second part, he says that an author or a poet or a writer should use proper choice of word. And then in the third part, he said that this choice of word or these all linguistic components should be properly arranged in a piece of literature. First, we will define what is literariness. Literariness is a type of formal writing style used to differentiate between literary and non-literary texts. So what comes in mind when we hear literariness? That it is a type of formal writing style. Then it is used in literary texts rather than non-literary text. Now, after defining literariness, we should know how literariness is achieved in literature. So, literariness is achieved through different techniques. For example, defamiliarization, deviating from existing rules or norms, and distorting practical language. First of all, we should know what is defamiliarization. Defamiliarization is a theory or technique in which an artistic or literary work is presented in an unfamiliar way. So, what does it mean? It means that the writer or the poet, they present common things to the audience in an unfamiliar or strange way so they could gain new perspective and see the world differently. Right? So how the audience perceive things previously or what seemed to the audience very much common, they make for them uncommon, or they make for them unfamiliar so they can take interest or they can gain new perspective and see the world differently. We are talking about the audience, right? Something which is not strange or something which is common. So the poet or the writers make them uncommon or make them unfamiliar. What is the purpose of making things uncommon or unfamiliar? The purpose is to gain new perspective and see the world differently. For who? For the audience. So this is called defamiliarization. Now, there is another technique through which literariness is achieved in literature, and that is called deviation or deviating from normal rules or existing rules of a language. So, what does deviation mean, or what is deviation? Deviation is to give different shape or different form to language. So, deviation is a departure from an established course or accepted standard. For example, in English, we have a standard to construct a sentence. What is standard? We use first subject, then we use verb, and then we use object. And if we notice, like a poet, so a poet may use first object, then he or she may use subject, and then he or she may use verb. Similarly, there may be a deviation in the form of phonology, what we call phonological deviation. There may be deviation in the form of morphology, what we call morphological deviation. There may be syntactic deviation. There may be graphological deviation. So we will explain these all deviation in coming slide. So right now we can say that what is deviation? To change the form of a language, or in other words, to take a departure from an established course or accepted standard or norms for using a language. So to change the form of a language, this is called deviation, right? Or other word, we have distorting practical language. So what is practical language? Like in everyday life situation, we use a language. So we can't find such kind of language in literature, particularly in a poem, or like in prose, or like sometime also in novel or drama. So we may not have syntactic deviation like in novel or prose, but we may have other kind of deviation. For example, phonological deviation, for example, morphological deviation, or sometimes it is possible to have also syntactic deviation in prose or novel. So we will explain these kinds of deviation in coming lecture. Makorowski says the function of poetic language consists in the maximum of foregrounding of the utterance. So he's talking about the importance of foregrounding. Here we have another definition or another notion to foregrounding. So foregrounding is the opposite of automatization, right? So automatization, something which is common, right? So foregrounding is the opposite of automatization related to defamiliarization. So foregrounding is related to defamiliarization. To estrange something is to foreground. So when you make something foreground, or when you foreground something, so it means that you are doing what? You are defamiliarizing something. So defamiliarization is the opposite of automatization. Thank you so much. It was all about this lecture. The purpose of this lecture was to introduce what is literary stylistic and what is foregrounding. We also introduce what is literature, and we also talk about what is literariness. And then we talked about defamiliarization, we talked about deviation, and we talked about distorting practical language. So now in the coming lecture, we will talk in detail foregrounding. What is foregrounding and what is the importance of foregrounding in literary stylistics? So keep watching and wait for this lecture. Thank you so much.